Good evening, and welcome to the Marian Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Michael Grauske, and I am one of the Ath Fellows this year. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's panelists, who will be discussing the state of the book publishing industry and the representation of diverse individuals and topics within that field. Yushun Lai is a graduate of CMC's class of 1996 and is the author of Not a Self-Help Book, The Misadventures of Marty Wu. She is also a literary editor at the Tahoma Literary Review and the Los Angeles Review. Ms. Lai will be joined tonight by Rachel Kahan and Kim Jones, two noted professionals from the publishing field. In addition to a moderated conversation regarding the panelists' recent experiences with publishing, this evening will feature readings from Ms. Lai's own work and the work of CMC alum Camille Griep from the class of 1999, who unfortunately will not be able to join us this evening. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Dr. Christine Crockett, Professor of Literature and Director of CMC's Center for Writing and Public Discourse, which has co-sponsored this event. As always, audio and visual recording is prohibited. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panelists to the Athenaeum.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Excellent. All right, so we'll be sharing these microphones all evening. It's so great to see you all here. Thank you for being here this evening. It is a great pleasure and a privilege. You can't hear me? All right. It is a great pleasure and a privilege to be moderating this panel with our fine experts on the publishing industry here today. As our Athenaeum Fellow lets you know, unfortunately, Camille Griep cannot be here today. And in light of that fact, we decided to change the panel up a little bit since we're missing one of our novelists. I think we'll stick to the panel conversation, and that will give us a longer Q&A session at the end of our evening together. And my hope is that we might find an opportunity to bring Camille to campus at another date. I am certain that we're going to have a lively conversation up here with the panelists who are able to make it today. My job, in brief, is to share a few questions that will get the conversation started, that will keep it going, and then to get out of the way and let our experts do their thing. I also want to make sure that we leave ample time for our Q&A at the end of the session. And to start off our conversation, I thought perhaps each of our panelists could just tell us a little bit more about what you do. How is it that you're connected to the publishing industry, and how did you get where you are?
We're going to start at this end? Yes. Okay. Yes, sir. Okay. Again, my name is Rachel Kahn. I'm an executive editor for William Morrow, which is a division of HarperCollins, which is one of the big five publishers in New York. I edit commercial fiction and nonfiction, and commercial in that sense means kind of what you would see on the bestseller lists or on the shelves in your local bookstore. And I have worked with a really diverse group of authors in my career, both in terms of genre, fiction, and nonfiction. I also work with many writers of color and with writers from outside the United States, both in translation and writing in English. Yeah, that's it.
Hi. Nice to see you all today. Thank you for coming. I am Ishan. I graduated from McKenna in 1996. And I've kind of been in publishing and writing ever since then. Rachel and I went to a lovely institution called the Radcliffe Publishing Course. So long ago.
In 1996.
In 1996, which is, I think, older than some of you. Anyway, moving along. I have been a writer and editor ever since then. I've been involved in all aspects of publishing, from the advertising end all the way to the marketing end, and then, of course, into the editorial end. This novel is my first novel. I'm published with a small publisher, so if you guys have questions about that, let us know. And yeah, that's about the long and short of it for now.
I'm Kima. I am the owner and founder of Jack Jones Literary Arts. It's a book publicity company based right out here in Los Angeles. Well, we're not in Los Angeles. I'm in Los Angeles. The company is 2 years old. I started out as a director of marketing for Beverly Hills Drug Rehab. I know. And I worked in recovery for a long time as a marketer. And, you know, I just found it to be soulless work. And I did not want to do it. I really love books. I've always been a reader. I care about books. And I said, how can I use my skills as a marketer to really impact this community that I'm a part of? And I decided to found Jack Jones when a lot of books that I was interested in, I noticed that they would be published on Tuesday, and by Friday you wouldn't hear about them again. I was so confused. Where are these books going? What void did they disappear into? And I noticed that a very particular set of books that kept happening. And I wanted to amplify those voices. And so I work on publicity campaigns. It's my job to get writers in front of TV, radio, magazines, NPR, podcasts, the like, newspaper reviews, digital outlets. And I work with the publishing houses, and I also am hired independently by authors. And I work, again, indie press, Big Five, across the board.
Great, thank you for that. And given your experiences, from your perspectives, why don't you tell us a little about the issues that are currently facing the publishing industry, which rise to the surface, in your opinion?
Of course, let's do it. Right now, I think if we are being honest, I think the We Need Diverse Books movement in YA and children's literature is probably getting the most controversy right now. There's a big movement toward making sure that more books by people of color are published, but also making sure that books that are deemed irresponsible thematically are not published. Obviously there are two sides to that argument. It surprises me that it's happening more in children's books than in literary fiction or some of the adult books, but I think part of that is that, especially with, I would say, Black books for children, a lot of the books tend to be historical rather than fictional. And by that I mean, like, you know, the story of Jackie Robinson or the story of Rosa Parks. And so there's a push to go away from the historical and just go into like fun, cute kids books. And there's this idea, well, where's the marketability for that? And we'll talk more about marketability, but I think that's a starting point for our conversation. I think especially if you're following it on Twitter, it has gotten pretty heated. And really uncomfortable in the children's book world around who's publishing writers of color in children's books and young adult titles and who's not.
So the We Need Diverse Books movement that Kima is referring to actually started out as a social media movement. And it essentially is based entirely around the idea that, well, we need diverse books. And unfortunately, there is no We Need Diverse Books for the adult book industry at this point.
No.
However, with that said, there are individual authors who are consistently pushing that forward. We are here to talk about diversity, and I think, for me, one of the things that it gets to the heart of the matter is economic diversity. Publishing has long been an industry that pays, we both know this from starting out early on, that pays absolute peanuts at the very beginning. Just to give you an idea, when I graduated in '96, my starting salary was $18,000 a year. That was New York City. I ate a lot of bar food. I ate a lot of ramen noodles. Yeah. So, you know, this is not a sustainable model, right? I think you all agree that $18,000 a year, granted that was '96, but the salaries for starting editorial assistants and for starting writers really has not gone up. I'm a freelance writer. As a freelance writer, that rate also hasn't gone up. In fact, it's gone down. When I first started writing, it was $1 a word. I just sold an article today for 1,000 words at $500. There's something wrong with that math, you guys. I mean, it's 20 years later, and I'm getting paid half the rate. Like, that's not copacetic, right? So this economic disparity that I'm talking about also trickles down into ethnic diversity, right?
Correct.
And this is a serious problem, right? If you don't address the economics of something, then you're certainly not going to ever get to the actual ethnicity of the diversity problem. So we need to address both of those things at the same time. And we're not getting there just yet, so.
I agree. I mean, I think that the We Need Diverse Books movement, I think, has been really has had a transformative effect in a lot of ways in YA and children's, but as you mentioned, it has not, this has not like trickled upwards into mainstream adult publishing, and there are some of us who are working very hard to kind of bring religion about this topic to editors of adult books and to publishers, and I think that it really comes down to the question of whose voices do we privilege? I mean, whose voices matters, whose lives matter, and traditionally, the book publishing industry in our country, the big commercial book publishing industry, it's been white people and representations of white people's lives. Some of this is because we live in a country where white viewpoints and white experience is privileged. Some of it is also simply because those are the people who are working in book publishing. And so when you have about 87% of editors who do commercial fiction are white people, usually sort of middle class, a lot of people like me. I mean, I grew up in middle class in the suburbs and went to a good school and went into publishing, and it's full of white women like me, and so you see a lot of, that's kind of, you know, writers write about what they know. A lot of editors like to edit books and put out books that are about what they know, and so if you are not constantly questioning yourself about whether you're breaking out of that mold and whether you're representing everybody's voices and everybody's experience, you get into this feedback loop, and that's why publishing is, it's a very white place, and you hear a lot of discussions about white gatekeepers is a term that comes up a lot, particularly in communities of writers of color, and they are not wrong to use that term, because publishers and editors in particular, because what we do is we acquire those books. So to a certain extent, the responsibility of deciding what the house is going to publish rests on our shoulders. So if we are mostly from this uniformly white background and we don't question that and we don't push, then we're going to continue doing that. And we're also going to continue hiring people like us, which is another huge problem in this business that some of us are working very hard to change, but it can be sort of slow going. I do think in the current political climate that there's going to be a new sense of urgency in book publishing in some ways about, you know, what are we doing to represent diverse experiences and viewpoints in a society where we've just had this experience of having that clamped down on in a lot of ways.
If I can piggyback, earlier in the workshop that I gave, I talked a little bit about this, but I'll touch on it more broadly. As Yishen was saying, and Ray, we can't underestimate how much economics plays into what's happening in book publishing, right? When we talk about who's hired, we're also talking about who is getting the internships. We're talking about internships, we're talking about where you went to school. We're talking about where you went to school, we're talking about what community you come from, how much you can afford to pay, right? And also if you can afford to work for free. And let me say that again, right? Most internships in this country are unpaid, right? Most students from underserved communities cannot afford to work for free to land that dream job at Random House. And so you are going to get a very particular kind of student, a very particular kind of intern, a very particular aesthetic. But we understand that's the institutionalization of that's how this works, and so I think we also have to really look at free labor. That's why I talk about it so much. Internships need to be paid. I would have loved to take. I went to Vassar. I would have loved to take an internship. Economically, it wasn't feasible for me to do that. I had to work while I went to school. And the idea of working 20 to 30 hours for free with no health care just didn't make sense to me, even if it was a way in, because how was I going to eat? And I think that when you have that kind of reality in front of you, so that my entry into publishing came much later, because not only are the majority of folks working in publishing white, but they're also about 24 to 27 years old, right? That's the other part of publishing that we don't talk about, is the diversity of age and experience. where you have writers 40 and 50 above publishing their debut books, and they really feel locked out of what's happening in the industry because people are awarded for youth. 30 under 30, 40 under 40, 20 under 20. These are real vehicles, and they launch careers. But if you weren't able to enter the publishing game until you were 35, until you were able to go to school, work a good job, get a mortgage, and then you start to send your work out, your experience in publishing is going to be very, very different from someone who came from a community where they could work for free, land that dream job, and make it.
I think that is changing, though. I mean, I know, Rachel, you work really hard to hire students from CUNY, as opposed to, so Rachel and I went to something called the Radcliffe Publishing Course, which was backed by Harvard and is now backed by Columbia University, and it was very expensive. In '96, it was $6,000 for a 6-week course. There are other publishing courses out there that don't cost as much, that produce students that are just as good. But they don't get as high of a billing because they are CUNY and not Harvard, right, as it were. Okay, so, or University of Denver, for instance, I think does a publishing course as well. But I know in Rachel's department, she's hiring folks from CUNY. So that world is changing. But keep in mind when we are talking about economic and ethnic diversity, I would like it if we could hold up the U.S. Census as a really good backdrop, right? We're 12% African American. We're 1% Native American, we're 4% Asian American, all right? So I would encourage you to look at your bookshelves. Go back and look at the last 100 books. Are the books that you're reading, are 12 of them by African Americans? Are 5 of them by Asian Americans? Do you have one Native American book on your shelf? And if you don't, then you're not even meeting the standard of what our United States comprises. And that I think, this readership that creates demand for the books that editors are going to publish is a very, very big deal. So, we need to start taking a look at our own bookshelves and kind of seeing that we're also meeting the standards of readers.
I agree, and I think in many ways it's getting better. If you look at the prize lists of the last couple of years, actually they've been majority writers of color, at least they were this year. But I mean, to be honest, it was a pretty low bar to begin with, so we've got a lot to make up for.
Why do you think that's changing?
I think some of it is that I think some of it has to do with greater awareness among the people who are on the prize committees. I think it's that the prize committees have expanded who's doing the nomination process. So if you have more people, like if you look at who's on those committees, you're going to have more writers of color, so they're going to be more aware of the work that's out there. And I think that publishers are doing a better job of promoting the work of talented writers of color. I also think just in this particular year, it was a banner year for not just fiction, but also nonfiction by writers of color. And that's all there is to it. Some of the best work that was done this year was by writers of color, and it got recognized because the quality was so good.
Okay. That's good news.
Yeah.
This makes me think that, so this conversation is happening in the industry, right? What does that conversation look like? How, for instance, is diversity being defined? It's such a kind of broad term, right? So what exactly does that conversation look like, and where is that happening?
I think Vita certainly started that conversation.
Yeah. Tell them what Vita is.
So
You're
Vita is an organization dedicated to amplifying the voices of women and gender nonconforming writers. And they put out the Vita survey, the Vita Count. And what they did was they went to all of the major print publications, and they just counted how many women writers were published in that publication over the last year. And I remember what year they started.
From the Atlantic,
right,
the New Yorker,
Harper's,
Poets and Writers, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books.
Agni, even literary magazine.
Yeah, and they were basically just looking to see, how many, it was books by women of color, or not women of color, just female writers were reviewed.
The first year was just female writers.
Right.
Last
And
year
now
they added also women of color. But the numbers were atrocious.
They were really eye-opening.
They were eye-opening, and a lot of outlets vowed to change and to make a difference and to seek, instead of women pitching them, they were going to seek female writers that they could have write for them. And I think the VITA numbers have gotten a lot better. You had some outlets that were at 20%. If they had published 200 writers that year,
40 maybe.
maybe 40 were women. And so VITA really started bringing about diversity, gender diversity into the conversation. And then you had folks saying, okay, that's great, but even out of those women, maybe 2 of them were Black and 1 of them were Asian and none of them were Latina, so what's happening there? And then they introduced the women of color count. And so I really think VITA kind of pioneered some of the diversity talk that's happening in publishing.
I think they did, and I think it was the rare instance where you can just really quantify lack of representation. And it was interesting seeing sort of who got on board and who didn't, because, for example, the New York Times Book Review was actually one of the offenders, and then they now have a female editor, Pamela Paul, and if you look now, their representation, not just with women, but with writers of color, is so different than it was before Pamela Paul took over. But then you also had like the Harper's Bazaar and Paris Review, who were grossly underrepresenting women writers, and we're just kind of like, yeah, well, women don't pitch us, and we don't really know good women writers who we would solicit their work. So
Right.
yeah, and they haven't changed much. So you just kind of know who's an idiot on the topic and who's not.
Or archaic, or just refusing to change.
Or just refusing to change, and then, behave accordingly.
I mean, what we're talking about here is awareness, right? At the end of the day, sometimes when you have something brought to you, I often will tout that figure that 89% of publishing was 89% last year, wasn't it? 88% this year, I think.
1%.
1% difference. Okay, so 88% of publishing is white, right? And people go, "Oh my God, I can't believe it. That's terrible. How can that be? That's crazy town, right?" But the fact is that once you know that figure, you're looking out for it, right? And you're paying attention to it. It's kind of like when you drive a Volvo and suddenly everybody else is driving a Volvo. You're like, "Oh wow, everybody drives Volvos," right? So once you know about this figure, then you can pay attention to it, and you know that it's out there, so you can do something about it, right? Whether that means reading more, or looking for more diverse readers, or agitating against that in some way, shape, or form, or just sharing that knowledge. That's a really big key, is just to make sure that you have that awareness. But the other part of it too is Lee and Lowe's study. We talked about the We Need Diverse study, right? And that was a big baseline study that addressed also book reviewers, I want to say. And Roxane Gay did a study that I just want to touch on really quickly about the number of female to male books that were reviewed in the New York Times.
Yeah.
Right? She went, and do you have those figures off the top of your head?
I don't.
Okay. So essentially what she did was she went back and she read through something like 380 reviews in the New York Times. And an overwhelming number of them, I'm not going to give you a figure because I don't have it and I don't want to misrepresent it, but it was an obscenely large number were books written by men, which is weird because I guarantee you that that's not the percentage of books that are being published out there that are by men, right? I mean, the number of books that are being published by men versus by women is definitely not the egregious number that Roxane Gay found to be reviewed in the New York Times that year. So there's a problem there too, right? Whose books are getting attention and whose books are getting reviewed? And you can speak to that really well because, I mean, you're talking about the number of books that you have to place on a regular basis,
Right.
And who reviews them.
That also, but also, just quickly on the diversity question, I think we also don't want to forget about queer diversity.
Right.
That continues to be a problem in publishing, but I think Lambda's doing a lot of work. And VITA, again, is doing a lot of work because for the first time, there was a gender nonconforming and a trans count. These were phrases not even in our lexicon 5 years ago. In our national lexicon. So in that way, a lot of the climate has changed. As for 97% of my roster is comprised of writers of color. And that's on purpose. It's absolutely on purpose. Someone has to balance this thing out. And I figure it might as well be me. And so let me back up. But again, part of that, right, is that we know that when there was the crash and money kind of went out of publishing and all of that happened and magazines suddenly stopped paying, we also know that publishers pulled marketing and they pulled publicity and they saved that for their really, really big books. Understandable. But what happens is that the small books sink, and there are just a lot of good books that are published every year that you never hear about and you're not going to hear about because they just don't have an engine behind them. And it was my feeling that how can I get those books in front of people, right? Colson Whitehead doesn't need my help. Zadie Smith doesn't need my help, right? Those are writers of color that you will find out about, that you will read, that will be anthologized. And my feeling was, how can I work with small, mighty books that really need the push, right? The other side of that is that publicity is cost prohibitive, right? And as we were saying before, writers don't make a ton of money. The average person will sell their first book for about $30,000. And that might be a 2-book deal, and you have to meet your royalties, right? And so to pay me, right, or any other publicist, so publicity starts at about $10,000, right, for a publicity campaign for a book. That's cost prohibitive when you're talking about someone's student loans and a job and children and a spouse. And so my feeling was, how can I do this work and advocate for writers, feed myself, and also talk about changes that need to occur in publishing. And the best way for me to do that is to work with publishers on a lot of their niche books. And that's how I started working specifically with some of the big 5, where I said, well, give me some of your smaller Asian, Latino, or Black books that you kind of don't know what you're dealing with, if we're being honest. You haven't found the audience for, you don't believe there's an audience for, you don't know how to talk about it. Let me talk about those books, and let me help amplify those books, because Simon & Schuster or HarperCollins can afford me in a way that the average author cannot. But again, yes, when we're talking about representation, you're talking about submitting those books, San Fran Chronicle, Washington Post, New York Times. When you're talking about the awards, publishers pay to submit books to awards. Most awards are not free, right? And if you're a small press on a small budget and the National Book Award charges $125 per book, you're going to be very picky about which books you send. You're going to send the books you think can win. You're not just to because you love all of the books in your roster that season. And so it helps if you have someone saying, well, look at all the work, look at all the media attention I was able to get for this book. I think we should submit this book too. It's much different from, this book didn't do anything, there are no numbers for it, there's no buzz about it, that book will never get submitted, right? That's part of getting that book through the door.
So, Rachel, the last 2 books I read from your imprint have been books by Asian American women. One is forthcoming. It's very, very cool. It's called Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. It's fantastic, you guys. It's great. Look for it. So tell me about how you see these books in your roster and how you manage to give these books equitable billing when they're written by marginalized voices.
They're voices that I really believe in, and I do think that there's a universality to storytelling that is transcultural, and the books that I publish that are by Asian women, African American women, I feel like the themes in them have universal appeal. I think that readers, when challenged, are still pretty good about embracing, oh, this is a story about love or family or food or travel or all these different things. And it may be from a culture that is different from their own or talking about experiences that they haven't had. But if it's a good story and told well, I want to bring it to people, and I feel like to a certain extent, I am gambling on the fact that, mainstream, by which I really mean the kind of white readers, middle America readers that we publish to, in addition to, so we might do a book that's by an Indian or Indian American writer or a Chinese or Chinese American writer, but I'm not thinking about just, are Chinese people going to come to this book? I mean, you do sort of market to your core constituency, but we need to have the book be a book that everybody is going to read, and that booksellers across the country are going to sell. And I think it's having the belief that there is universality of experience and that publishers need to start behaving that way, because there simply has been this idea of that your typical kind of white American suburban reader is going to say, like, oh, well, I just can't identify with someone from this community or from someone from this country. And I really have kind of a higher opinion of your average American reader than that. I think that they can enjoy that book and they can identify with it, and they should be challenged to do that. And I think that that's part of my job, and it's a part of my job that I take very seriously, because I have seen the way that these books transform people's ideas. So, for example, one of my best-selling authors is an Afghan-American novelist who is the daughter of Afghan immigrants. Her books are mostly set in Afghanistan. Her first book, which was called The Pearl That Broke Its Shell, was a bestseller about young girls in Afghanistan. Her second book was about refugees and the refugee crisis, and it actually was written before the current Syrian refugee crisis, but it's about a family of Afghan immigrants who are sort of trapped in Europe and trying to kind of find asylum. And that book, you feel, even if you are not from that world, it is such a kind of thought-provoking, heart-opening book. And the reader response to it has just been tremendous. And I feel like that book, if you read it, will change the way that people think about the current refugee crisis. And I felt that was an incredibly important book to publish, because I think sometimes fiction especially changes people's thinking. The other book that I edited that's currently a bestseller is called Hidden Figures, and there's a movie of the same title that's just out now, which you should all go see. And
It's on the list for the Academy Awards, guys. If you
Yeah.
missed it, you need to go see it.
But that is a book, it's nonfiction, that is about brilliant African American women working for NASA in starting from 1940 and going through about 1970. And that's just, the author of it said, I want to tell black stories that are not the typical, what she said, this goes back to what you were saying, Kima, like slavery, civil rights, Obama. Like that's the trajectory of the African American experience according to sort of the way a lot of people think. She's like, that's not it. I want to talk about the kind of extraordinary average lives of these women. And I felt that was tremendously important, both talking about this part of the African American experience, but also talking about women in STEM, which is something that we're all thinking about too. So I think that all of this to say, what am I looking for, and why do I feel that you can change people's minds, and particularly right now when I'm not feeling especially optimistic about diversity and I see what's going on. I think that what we do is going to be more and more important, because there's something incredibly subversive about books, and there always has been. Books really have changed the world and changed the way people think, and that's why I do it, and that's what I look for.
I think for me, we really only read for two reasons. And the first is to get to know somebody new, and the second is to feel not so alone. And if you look at those two reasons in this particular climate today, it's so much more important for us to read diverse literature and for us to be publishing diverse works. So, what you say is fabulous to hear. But I understand last year, did you tell me that you, in your department, had published more diverse books than your entire department?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, I do a lot, but it only looks like a lot because nobody else is really doing that. I mean, yeah, it's not like I'm anything special really. But yes, one of the things I did, I'm working on a bigger corporate initiative, trying to kind of drag the corporation along. And one of the things that I did was I just went to my colleagues and I said, can you send me a list of authors whose books you edit who are from a marginalized racial or ethnic group? And I actually had, this one woman who has been working in the business for longer than I have, who's wonderful and has edited many big, famous, best-selling people whose names you would know if I said them. And she was like, I just realized that only one of my authors is not white. She had never thought about it. Like, that was just not something, like, and this is not this was not like she was sitting there being like, I just really love the white viewpoint and I want to promote it. It wasn't that. It was this kind of, I think, just what I talked about earlier, like an unconscious bias of, are these characters who I can identify with? And it's like, you know what, guys? It's not unconscious anymore because we're talking about it. So there's no excuse to be, and I didn't say that to her, but that was kind of when I was talking to my colleagues, I was like, look, we know that we need to do better, and if you can really quantify it in the same way that Kima was talking about with Vita, then you're gonna see that you're not publishing 12 African American authors out of the 100 books you do. You're not publishing like one Native American author. So we need to think about that. We need to do better, and it's not like there's not talent out there. There's talent out there. We're not doing a good job of accessing it.
Do you think that the industry is going to follow your lead? Are there other Rachels out there? Are these discussions happening in such a way in which the industry is moving in a particular direction? So what does that response maybe look like looking forward? What do you all think is the kind of future response to the diversity question?
I mean, I feel like, just speaking for the big five, because that's who I've always worked for, I think we're doing better with it. I think that there are a couple of sort of impediments. One is that we're not really doing any better in terms of hiring from a diverse candidate pool. So if you look at kind of the level I'm at executive editor level, which is kind of the highest level of editors, it's really white, and then you look at the editorial assistants, and they're really white. So, like, if we aren't hiring more people from these communities now, then 20 years from now, it's going to look the same as it looks now. And so that's something that I'm really, and it's not just me, there are other people as well. And children's books and YA is doing, at least in my own company, so much better work with this than adults. But that's going to be a big part of it. It's like, if we're going to continue to just be a business of white gatekeepers, then no, I don't feel really optimistic about it. Get some wobble there.
Guys, are we falling off the table? Can you guys see the leg?
Have we all just leaned into the table?
We just want to get closer to you guys.
That feels better.
Right. Are we off the?
We just want to be on the platform.
Right. Don't want to be in the audience.
That's right.
It's an earth-shaking discussion we're having.
Yes, it is.
Anyways, that's.
And in terms of diversifying the community, I also don't want to underestimate the force that Cave Canem is and has been when we're talking about, and just the residency model in general. For those who aren't familiar, they're writing residencies around the country. I would say Bread Loaf is probably the most prestigious. You have Vermont, and then there you participate in the workshop model, right? And you meet with agents and editors, and you're able to pitch, and it's networking, and it's a way in, and you usually have to be recommended. You win a scholarship, and so there are communities of color who took that model and made it completely inclusive of themselves. And so you have Kundiman for Asian writers, you have the Asian American Writers Workshop for Asian writers, you have Cantamundo for Latino writers, you have Kimbilio and Cave Canem for Black writers, African diaspora writers. And so you're talking about Cave Canem is probably the oldest in the country. It's 20 years old, turned 20 years old this year. And so you're talking about every Pulitzer Prize winning, National Book Award winning, NBCC winning, NEA winning Black poet that you know of, that you've heard of, that you've studied in the last 20 years has come from that group. And so what they've done is they've changed the way Black poetry is talked about in this country, right? And so that's why a Claudia Rankine Citizen can do the work that it's done in this world, or Robin Cost Lewis, or Elizabeth Alexander. All of these people are Cave Canem. Rita Dove was one of the first lecturers. Terrence Hayes. These are all National Book Award winners. And so it's really changed and elevated the conversation around Black literature. And then we see that with other groups. And what happens is if you are in a workshop with Terrence Hayes is now writing you a recommendation letter. Terrence Hayes is now opening doors for you. And so there are a lot of opportunities that have been created for writers of color through these in-house networks. I belong to a few, I'm also Kimbilio, and it's important because it's nice to not be the only person in the room sometimes. And we know that, again, talking about the whiteness in publishing, right, that also comes out of the MFA model. We have to at some point discuss the MFA, which is cost prohibitive for a lot of folks, right? To say I'm going to spend $40,000 to study craft.
And not business, by the way.
And not
That is
business. I'm going to
shocking.
study craft.
Shocking.
I'm going to talk about narrative. I'm going to spend $40,000 to talk about narrative distance. Right?
Point of view.
That's a privilege. And so it's much different when you have faculty of color in the room with you, when you have administrators of color, when you have a diverse reading list, a syllabus, right? When you can read the canonical text alongside your contemporaries, your experience is much different than when you're told that those works are not worthy of conversation.
So I want to answer Christy's question, and then I'd love to pick up on what you just said. For me, I think a big key to this is small and independent press. Small and independent press is doing a very good job of picking up writers with marginalized voices. My own press, Shade Mountain, only does one book a year, and they only do books by writers who identify as female. And then on top of that, they only do books by writers who are marginalized. So it's presses like that you have to look for. And granted, the product isn't going to always be fantastic, but if you find the right one, then you're going to have a really good chance of being able to open the door into more diverse reading, into more diverse lit. Your point before about the residencies that are geared towards minorities, I had a really interesting conversation with somebody one time on a panel where I was in the audience and she was on the panel, and they were talking about how to elevate the marginalized voice. And at the time I was actively pitching my novel, and I really wanted to know, that's great, and it's, what you're doing is fantastic. It can't be overstated enough that it's important to give minority voices a place to feel safe, right? A place to be recognized among your contemporaries, among your peers. But what I'm most concerned about as a writer is getting my voice into the mainstream. So how do we get these marginalized voices into the mainstream? How do I find success as a writer? And the person on the panel said, well, I think you need to redefine your idea of success.
And
I said,
mainstream.
and mainstream. And that made me really angry, because my definition of success shouldn't be any different from any one of you guys, right? My definition of success is cover spy, tweeting about some person reading my book on the New York City subway. It is the New York Times picking up my book review. It is folks talking about my book on a regular basis, not because I'm marginalized, but because it's a great read that has a universal message to it, right? My book is very simple. It's Bridget Jones's Diary meets the Joy Luck Club. Who can't get behind that, right? I mean, it's difficulty in human relationships, right? We can all understand that, right? And that speaks to the university messages, the universality of messages that you're talking about. So, for me, this idea of writers' residencies that cater to a specific demographic is super important. But I'm wondering about where that ends, and how it is that we get to the point where we don't have to redefine our ideas of success and of majority, right? I mean, I think that's a valid question to ask. And I don't know about that. I mean, I'd love to hear from you both about that and what that looks like to you.
Well, I will say, I think the whole idea of you have to redefine like what mainstream, what success is kind of some bullshit. Because like what is that? I mean, first of all, it sort of implies that you will always be outside the mainstream because
Right.
you are a woman writer of color, and also the like success. Well, you shouldn't be aspiring to the same kind of success, be that money or review coverage or whatever. I mean, maybe they were trying to do you a favor by saying like, don't get your hopes up because it's a cold world out there, which I think is always sort of useful advice to all writers everywhere, just in general. But no, other than that, I think it's kind of bullshit. And I don't know. The truth is, I'm maybe not the best person to answer this question simply because the kind of writers who I publish are not literary, and they tend to not come out of those groups. My authors don't have MFAs. They're not prize winners for the most part. So, they're just very straight up the middle, mainstream. And what I try and do is publish my authors who are women of color, because they're mostly women of color, no differently. And so saying something like, it's Bridget Jones' Diary meets the Joy Luck Club, like, that works. I want to read that book. The fact that the Bridget Jones, well, yeah, I did. But the fact that the Bridget Jones in that case is Taiwanese is not, like, that should not be an impediment. And,
Right.
and a good publisher can position the book in such a way that shouldn't be a problem, I think.
And I don't believe in the universal. So I'm on this end of the spectrum, just in that I mean, I understand, I think most people here understand the universal is always white, right? And so if you're operating, and the best way to frame this, I guess, for me to think about it is to say, yes, all cultures, we talked about this a little bit earlier, Christine, but, all cultures have this oral tradition of storytelling that's been passed down. But the actual novel, right, came from a very specific place and has a very specific history, right? And the novel was a pastime for rich women to find pleasure, and it was read aloud in tea room, and you had to have a certain amount of money. You had to be able to afford it. It was for pleasure. And so when I'm thinking about taking on a book, or when I'm thinking about marketability, or I'm talking about universality, this conversation is great until that author is sent their publicity questionnaire, right? Because really what that is that's a demographic questionnaire, right? It's saying, are you queer? Are you black? Are you Taiwanese? Are you Latino? Are you Puerto Rican? Were you born here? Were you not? Because that's going to direct where I pitch your book, or where your publicist pitches your book, or where we think your book can work. We don't want to leave out any demographic, right? And so there's always this distillation toward who the author is on an anthropological level, as opposed to this esoteric notion of universality that I don't believe in really exists in publishing currently. And so to a degree, sure, yes, I understand that there's a Bridget Jones meets Joy Luck Club. I have a book right now, they're calling it Pretty in Pink meets South Bronx. Right, I didn't come up with it. I would never say that. I would never say that.
I think that
but
sounds pretty good.
But it sounds good, and it sounds good. But it's also racially and culturally marked, right, in such a way
much so.
to make people feel better about their curiosity.
Yeah.
And so, right, South Bronx, it's a Puerto Rican, Pretty in Pink. You're dealing with a young girl, and so I'm cautious. I hear the argument, but I'm still cautious of it. And I'm cautious because I know that 9 times out of 10, my job is to explain to white readers why they should read a book. That is my job. It is to say, I know that a non-white person read this, but you should read it for these reasons. And if we look at the way books have been published, if we want to talk about that, the way books have been marketed, if you have an Asian book by an Asian writer, Asian American writer, you're going to have some kind of mango on the cover, or sari, or a teacup, or chopsticks in the hair, red, gold, dragons, and right? Those are all markers that say something very specific. And the same way, when you have a black writer, for some reason, there's always a porch that looks like a cabin of some kind. There's an African.
You're not wrong, you guys.
I'm
Go
not.
home and look at your bookshelves.
If
I
it's
mean,
an
you will see.
African writer, there's always the tree. There's a tree. There's a giraffe. Maybe they can fit in an elephant. And so we're also talking about received narratives, and I think it's important to talk about received stories here. And so when we're talking about universality, I think also what we're saying, and what Rachel said really well, is that we have to, it's our job to teach readers, to do some redirection and to say, when you pick up a book by an African writer, there may not be a civil war in this text, and that is okay. That's fine, and that you can read this book, and that you can familiarize yourself with it, and you can receive pleasure from it, and you can think critically about it, right? That's the work that we're trying to do, or that every book by an African American is not going to be a multi-generational, up from slavery novel, and that you will be able to get into it. That's it.
Yep. I agree.
So here's what I'm thinking right now. I'm thinking that given the landscape that you've sketched out for us, do you have a sense of maybe a couple of things? Maybe the biggest obstacles that you think that that come when you think about fostering a diverse or inclusive landscape in the industry? Or if not an obstacle, then maybe some cause for hope in the industry that might lend itself towards fostering an inclusive or diverse industry?
I mean, I think I would go back to saying that the biggest obstacle that I see now is still in the hiring processes at the big corporate publishers, and until we get that part right, we're going to continue to have this problem for another generation.
Agreed.
I think that the hope that I see two things. One is that, as I said, I think we're moving from the point where it was all unconscious bias to the fact that we're being more conscious and talking about it, so we can't fall back on I didn't notice this. I think that it's being brought up, and I think that in publishing there is a real sense now that we're in a time where white supremacy is even more ascendant in our culture now because of what's happened in the recent election, and there's a real feeling that one of the things that we can do to resist that is going to be focusing more on making sure that there are diverse voices and promoting those, and promoting kind of an alternative narrative to this received narrative that, what we call a nationalist, that this was a nationalist election won by a nationalist president, that's just euphemistic. That's not what it's not nationalist, because if it were really nationalist, it would include all of the people in this nation. It's code for white supremacy, and I think that there's, the thing that I have seen since the election is kind of renewed effort, and maybe that will galvanize us a little bit more.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we've talked quite a bit about the big roadblocks that are in our way, but I think now more than ever that we are so divided as a nation, we are in a very good position to really pay attention to how much we are educating ourselves and our friends and our people around us. Our peer groups are more accessible than ever. We're in an era of heightened communication with each other, and we are in a position to know more about each other than we ever have before. Some people say that social media is the bane of the world. I think it's fantastic, right? I mean, the fact that we can learn about news that's happening from someplace across the country or around the world at a split second is really a boon, because it forces us to be awake and to be alert and pay attention to what's happening. More than ever, I've seen my peer group struggle and try really, really hard to find out what's going on the other side of the think tank, and figure out, why it is that people think and believe the way they do. And that's a really good move in the right direction, really good move. So I see great hope for our time moving forward, I think.
I was talking to this brilliant table of young scholars over here, having dinner with them, and we talked a lot about this very subject, and I was saying, some mornings, like this morning, you hear news about a wall, and you're paralyzed. I was paralyzed. I was like, okay, I'm gonna stay in bed for an extra hour, and take this in, and I will never open up my Twitter app in bed again. This is a really bad idea. And you kind of feel assaulted by the news sometimes. But for the most part, I am a very optimistic person, and I have to remain hopeful to do this work. And I think, especially given our country's history, it's right there. We can look back at the protest art. We can look at what writers, artists, visual artists have done in the past to kind of get through tough times. And I do believe in the power of art to sustain me mentally and physically. What does scare me, though, and scares many of the folks at this table, we talked about censorship. Censorship frightens me. The idea that journalists can be arrested for doing their jobs terrifies me. It's terrifying. I worry about which is outside of publishing, but it's all writing, and I worry about that. I worry about the work that PEN America does if it's going to be focused here. If 4 journalists can be arrested and charged with felonies, it's absolutely frightening. In those ways, I'm scared, and my fear forces me to get out of bed because I can't just sit there. I have to work. Something has to be done. And I do believe in the transformative power of art, of all the arts. And I think artists have always been the change makers. Marginalized groups have always been the change makers. Queers have always been the change makers. And I think that's why people are trying to silence those groups. That's why people ban books. That's why people censor journalists, because they're doing the work that has to be done. So publishing, I'm going to remain optimistic. I'm going to, anytime I can get a new intern, paid internship, or talk someone into taking on a young writer and mentoring them, I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to get as many students of color through the door as possible. Journalism, I'm worried, and I'm going to stay worried, and I'm going to stay watchful also. I don't think that we can take our eyes off the news for more than a second, because we're going to miss it. So much is happening every single day, and we're only 5 days in.
So I promised you all that we'd leave plenty of time for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, I'm sure that our Athenaeum Fellows will be able to help you to a microphone.
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and Sarah or I will come to you.
Don't be shy.
Hi, my name is Alejandra. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited to be here. I just had a question, Rachel. Earlier you'd mentioned how you do work as well with Spanish and foreign language books. And I was wondering how you think that market will be changing, if so, in the next couple of years, kind of based on the rhetoric around this is America, you speak English here, no matter what the language is. And I was wondering how you think that market will change.
You mean in terms of Spanish language authors being published in English or in Spanish?
In Spanish, or any foreign any foreign language books being published here in the United States.
Well, I think that I will say that's a pretty small market, and one that's not my area of expertise, because the authors who I publish in translation, I'm publishing in English. I think that the Spanish language market, and also the market for Latino writers in English has been a really difficult one for publishers. And actually, if you look at Publishers Weekly, their back page this week is by a former New York City councilman, and he really takes, especially the Big Five, to task about how they just have not been able to effectively market. Some of the problem has to do with finding booksellers and the channels that we sell into, because publishers are not a direct consumer business. So, for example, one of the biggest book selling chains for a long time to the Spanish language market and to Latinos was Borders, which went out of business several years ago. I think like maybe their second most profitable store was in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and they sold so many books there. And then when Borders went out of business, no bookstore, there is no major chain bookstore like that in San Juan today. So booksellers kind of aren't good at filling the gaps, and I think that this is also a problem for publishers, because, as I said, one of the problems, like we don't, for the most part, employ people from those communities, and we don't have people who are knowledgeable in sales and marketing, and it's just kind of ridiculous. The authors who I've worked with who have been successful, I've sold in translation from Spanish, but it was really done in a way that was marketing them not particularly to a Hispanic audience at all, and I wish I had sort of deeper thinking about that, but it's not. And I do think that one of the advantages of Amazon, and I have feelings about Amazon, but one of the benefits of Amazon is that they make available books by writers of color that booksellers, American bookselling chains especially, have just really neglected. I don't want to totally go on the record about this, but certain large American brick and mortar booksellers, and there aren't that many left, so you can guess who I'm talking about, are not good at selling books to anything outside of what they sort of perceive as like this white suburban audience. So you see, especially like with good African American commercial fiction, like the sales on Amazon are huge. Like Amazon has really filled that gap. And I think you see it also with Spanish language and, writing for the Latino community, because Amazon is always there. It's very accessible. And it's one of the benefits of not just ebooks, but in their print business too.
Speaking anecdotally, university presses, which is a section of the publishing world that we haven't talked about yet, are still doing a really good job around Spanish language books or books in translation. So that's one sector that we want to pay attention to in the future, in terms of books in other languages. But it is rare, I think, that you'll find books that are actually written in the other language and that stay in the other language, right? Mostly they'll be translations, but you will find university presses, I think, doing a really good job in that area.
And if I, really quickly, Alejandra, you also want to look at YA. YA is doing this work.
Yep.
One of my spring books, The Education of Margot Sanchez, right? I took it on because the book has Spanish, non-italicized Spanish in the book. And you realize this might be the first time that a kid's going to see Spanish text in a book. And so I think YA is, and that's why it's so controversial, right? Because the Spanish is published right alongside the English. There's no italics. What does the lack of italics say? So YA is really having those kind of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
You want to check there. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thanks so much for coming tonight. Really happy to see CMC bringing more people from a diverse range of industries versus just finance. Yeah.
Oh, no, we are still about the finance and publishing, just FYI. I
Yeah,
still do want to make
yeah,
more than $18,000
but also
a
coming
year,
at it
so.
from more of like the
English
content
majors.
perspective.
English majors.
English major.
That's right.
My first question was about just, I guess, pressure to write about white characters. One, this is especially for Ishan, the worry that if you write about a character who is of your same racial background, then people will assume that character is you. And then also, I remember once submitting a manuscript to an agent who sent it back to me saying, oh, I think that you're running into some racial stereotypes. For instance, the senior president is Asian, and another Asian character's parents are always badgering them about their schoolwork, and this is a stereotype, and you shouldn't fall into it. So, and then realizing that, okay, if I'd just written these characters as white, this wouldn't have been an issue. And then my second question is more about Takima and Rachel, who work with a diverse range of authors, about women who choose to write under male pen names or pen names that are gender ambivalent, like they choose the first two, like J.K. Rowling, for instance, and people who choose to write and pretend they are male or at least not identify themselves as female, and why they do that.
Great questions.
Yeah, really good questions. Okay, so the question about writing one's identity. First of all, anybody who tells you that fiction is 100% fiction is lying. Telling you a fiction, theoretically. Because we really only do write what we know, right? Whether we've experienced something emotionally or whether it's tangentially related. Lee Child, who is, maybe I told you this story before, but Lee Child writes thrillers to the tune of, I don't know, millions of copies of books. It's crazy town. But he writes about this guy who was an army military policeman, and he is a very tall man, and he's huge and goes around like beating people up all in the name of like goodness and faith and all that stuff. Anyways, it turns out that Lee Child's not even American. He's British, okay? And he's never served in the armed forces, and he's really got no idea what it's like to actually serve in the armed forces. He's also never had anybody kidnapped from him before to save his life, okay? But regularly, these things happen to Jack Reacher, his main character, right? I mean, he gets shot. Lee Child's never been shot. He's had people kidnapped from him. Lee Child's never had anybody kidnapped from him before. So a reporter asked him one time, well, if you've never had anybody kidnapped from you, then how can you write these scenes so viscerally, right? I mean, how can you write them so people really believe them? And Lee Child said, yeah, I've never actually had anybody kidnapped, but I did lose my child one time in a grocery store for 18 minutes, and it was awful. So he took that feeling and he just kind of imagined it until it became so unbearable that it felt like it was like 3 days without his child, right? And then he just reimagined it into this story. That's what writing is all about, right? It's about making that connection to somebody or making that connection to an event that you may not have experienced yourself, but you experienced something like it, right? So for instance, none of you have ever showed up at prom and had pig blood poured all over your heads, okay? It happened to Carrie, right? How did Stephen King write that character so that it was so incredibly awful? Well, Stephen King was bullied as a kid. He knows what that feels like, okay? So he took that feeling and he wrote it into a character that gets pig blood poured on her head at the biggest social event of the year, right? So when you write your identity, yeah, you'll run into that. You'll run into that problem, because people already have this preconceived notion of who Asian parents should be or who Asian kids should be. But there is a way to write stereotypes so that it does ring true, right? And that's the great test for any writer is to take something that may seem stereotypical on the outside, but then make it seem so real. And the way you do that is by connecting it to an emotion that we've all had, right? And we're going back to universality again. I'm sorry. Okay. So,
every day.
So every single day, she's got to fight this battle. So the idea is just that, right? I mean, how do you reimagine a situation that you may or may not have been into before into something that people can identify with and can really hang their hats on? And the second part of your question was writing stereotype. I think I already did that, didn't I? Right. So the idea behind writing stereotype is to make sure that you don't do it, right? I mean, you find a portion of that person that rings true as a human being on a very natural level, on an organic level, and then you write to that instead. That's the way it happens. As to the person who picked up all their stereotypes in your work,
Were they white?
were they white?
Yep.
I
Don't
don't
listen
know
to
what
that
to
person.
yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, yeah, so this unconscious bias thing, and everybody's here is familiar with that phrase, right, and what that means. Okay, so unconscious bias is insidious because it's nobody's fault, right? It's just something that happens. But our job is to then rally against that. The job of that reader is to pick this up and be like, why am I reacting this way to this character? Okay, because I'm sure that he or she knew a class president who was Asian and probably just latched onto it because he thinks that kid was also a tiger, paper tiger, mom, paper tiger. Got straight A's, you know, did all the school activities, ended up going to Harvard or Yale or CMC. Okay, and has probably latched onto that, right? That lies with the reader, not necessarily with the writer. So it's kind of, you know, you kind of weigh those criticisms and see whether or not they actually ring true to you as the writer. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Do you want to talk about the second
Yeah.
question, Kima?
My
I'll
feeling
say
about
something.
gender neutral identity. I mean, I don't have any writers who have gender neutral names. I mean, as a queer person, I'm into it, right? As a marketing professional, I'm looking at J.K. Rowling and I'm clapping really, really loudly for that woman, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? That was So I think it can be a subversive act, especially if you come out from behind that curtain and say, ta-da, right? And so could J.K. Rowling have got through the door that she got through otherwise? Maybe not. Maybe there would be no Potter,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so kudos to J.K.
Yeah.
I'm here for it. I don't know. I don't think it's necessary. Let's say that. I think, you know, if you have a very feminine identified name, I don't think you need to change your name, shorten your name. If you feel like your name sounds too ethnic, I don't think you need to manipulate it in any way. Not at all. No.
I mean,
If that's the
I think you
question, no.
call yourself whatever you want to call yourself. I do think, yeah, it's funny because yes, I have seen female writers want to use their initials primarily because they felt that they would be taken more seriously
Yes.
if they didn't have a feminine sounding first name. I'm not going to tell them they're entirely wrong about that because I do think that there is a lot of bias in the business, particularly in some things like writing thrillers and that sort of thing. There are a lot of thriller writers who tend to use initials because they're trying to capture both the male and female audience, and there's a perception that male readers will not read that kind of book by women. I don't think it's an entirely erroneous perception. I will say that I had, many years ago, I published an amazing first novel by a writer named Christopher John Farley, who's now an editor at the Wall Street Journal. He's Jamaican American, and he was actually writing the book in the voice of a young West Indian woman. And so he decided to go with C.J. Farley because he actually went the other way. He didn't want the reader to immediately know that he was male because he was writing a book in a female voice. And I actually thought it was a really good book, and I thought that not all male writers are capable of writing well from a female perspective, but he did. And so we did it that way. And, you know, then there are also times where the gender is not always clear because the name is not is a foreign name or in a different language. And so, for example, there's one of the best books of this past year was by a writer born in Ghana named Yaa Gyasi. The novel was called Homecoming. It's like, and it was, you know, I think a lot of people didn't know that she was a female writer when they saw that name.
From Alabama, also.
Yeah, she's from Huntsville.
She's
Like,
from Huntsville,
raised in
Alabama.
Huntsville. But I think that there was at least initially a little bit of like, who is that? So it's definitely still a thing. But I'm with Kima. I don't think that you should feel like it's something that you need to do. I would never encourage my authors to do it. If they came to me and said they wanted to do it, I would be down, but I would not tell them to do it.
Never.
Sorry, was the question why they do it or why it might be good to do such thing?
I think that female authors feel, not incorrectly, that they are more likely to be taken seriously if there's some ambiguity about their gender. And I think that when you look at the way books by women are treated versus the way books by men are treated, that's not incorrect. So that is some of why they choose to do that.
Going back to J.K. Rowling, we all know that she published a book under the name Robert Galbraith. It was a hard-boiled detective novel. Her hero, Cormac, is a damaged, hard-drinking detective, right? And it's one of those things where when she was outed as J.K. Rowling is, a female, then she had to rejigger it again and actually read under a male name that was not at all ambiguous, right? So, and then what happened to her reviews? Did she end up getting better reviews when they found out that she was J.K. Rowling?
Well, by the time people found out,
Yeah.
the book had been out for a while. It had gotten respectable reviews when
Right.
no one knew that it was J.K. Rowling who'd written it, and
Right.
then it came out, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, it's a new book by J.K. Rowling," and it went on to become incredibly to sell millions of copies. It had been very not particularly successful in terms of sales when no one knew that it was by her.
But that's a good lesson too, right? I mean, she wanted to write hard-boiled detective novels, and so she did it regardless of what her genre was to begin with, right? So it's a good thing.
Other questions?
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions, but just a heads up that there are books for sale in the lobby via the Huntley Bookstore. Please join me in thanking tonight's panelists. Thank you.